Cheers, guys. Epix 911. Welcome to the second of these VR podcast episodes. Want to thank you guys for the feedback for that first episode. The name suggestions have been awesome. Keep them coming. What I think I'm going to do is probably get about a week under my belt of these episodes. First thing to decide at that point will be, is it something I want to proceed with? You know, am I happy? Is it living up to the promise of lower editing time, etc.? So far it is, but yeah, I'll do that at that point, go over the names, tweaks, etc. to make to it, and we'll take it from there. But so far, so good, enjoying it. So thanks, guys. What I want to do is touch on some of the discussion points from the first episode, and then we're going to dive feet first, basically into kind of the newer stuff that I want to talk about. So the first thing that kind of garnered some discussion was my yapping about optimization and streamlining. Just wanted to clarify, because even me going back to listen to it, it kind of sounds like I'm down on stuff like foveated rendering. Not the case at all. What I would like to see, though, is a certain base level of performance. Look, if you purchase something like the Oculus Rift, it's advertised and it's marketed as a 1080p capable device, running at 90 frames per second, right? The 90 hertz refresh rate. I would like to see, if you've got a medium level GPU or higher, my feeling is most games should be able to deliver baseline performance of that 90 frames per second at 1080p. Then rely on stuff like foveated rendering to provide additional eye candy above and beyond that baseline. What I don't want, and what I really don't like seeing, is using something like foveated rendering as a crutch, right? The game is so poorly coded and non-optimized that it runs at 30, 45 frames per second, has to rely on something like foveated rendering or all kinds of, asynchronous reprojection just to hit the marketed baseline. So that's kind of where I was coming from. Hopefully that makes more sense. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about real quick had to do with the modular aspect of HMDs when I talked about making components modular. There was some discussion about the lenses, right? A couple of you felt pretty strongly about dust being a possibility if it's left for consumers to swap. And I agree. As is, that would absolutely be the case. But it would probably be the lowest priority thing I would see that you would need to swap in one of these devices. In fact, the only time I could really see you needing to swap it is if there was damage to the lens, right? Just based on how these are created, you've always got that front-facing portion that's going to be where the user views it. There's always potential to scratch that. So yeah, I see that as kind of the lowest priority. The priority item would probably be the screen, which in the Rift and the Vive is Samsung tech, the 1080p screens, swap in a 4K, etc. Next would probably be audio and cosmetic components, right? My foam has definitely seen better days. That one is already modular. You can swap it out. But what about the headphones? Maybe there's options with better frequency. That's kind of where I was going with that. But let's say you did have damage to the lens and you did want to swap it out. If you remember the first gen, the DK1 and DK2 units, they actually had interchangeable circular lenses. That was before they went to the hybrid Fresnel design. And left could be right, right could be left. Now they've kind of gone with a more proprietary left is left, right is right. And if you view any kind of a teardown video, what you see is the lens rests on top of a plastic housing. And it's a housing that is kind of narrow, holds the lens, and then widens a little bit and is open at the bottom, that plastic housing. That portion rests against the screen inside. So my thinking is, look, most likely, yeah, you'd probably go to a shop to do that for you if you did damage it. But if you had to at the consumer level, you could probably design something with some type of automated system where there's a flap on that lower portion so dust can't get trapped in. Because I do agree, dust is a pain in the arse, and it's like a dead pixel. Once you see it, yeah, you can't not see it. It's just there, right? So have it where you take out the old, put the new in, and only when it's in place does that inner flap open. Something along those lines. But again, absolute lowest priority as I see it in terms of modular components you'd want to swap out. So next thing I wanted to talk about, guys, and it's, I'm a stats guy. I love stats, etc. One of the things I noticed, because there's quite a few of you that I Steam chat with or direct message via Twitter, is noticing people with VR units play a lot of non-VR. Now, of course, as gamers, we're going to play other stuff, right? Myself, before bed, I can usually be spotted with a 3DS. I'm playing Etrian 5 at the moment. I love Civilization still on my computer, even though it's been Audio Shield and Fallout 4 pretty much for the most part. But at a high, it was probably 90% VR or 95% even, 5% other gaming. Now I'd say it's about 65-35, maybe even 70-30 in VR's favor, with a bit more of the rest. Some of you I barely see play VR anymore at all. So yeah, just curious where you guys are at individually. Let me know in the comments, what would you say your kind of split is and what the reason is for it. Lack of games? Are you bored? Technical reasons? Just, again, being a stats guy, curious as hell. Now, let's talk Vorpx. This is one that I wanted to talk about in the first episode, but I hadn't done it justice, hadn't kind of put it through its paces. So we'll talk about that, but let's rewind to when Vorpx was first released. The idea behind Vorpx was always, look, we are going to take a non-virtual reality game, bend it to Vorpx's will, and allow you to enjoy kind of a quasi-VR experience. I say quasi because it's obviously not built from the ground up or even with any kind of developer intervention to add VR functionality. It's just taking a game like BioShock Infinite and forcing it to be displayed in VR. And to do that, there's lots of variables. There's your field of view that you got to tweak. One of the problems for me with Vorpx has never been the price. At about $40 US, I would say if it can live up to the promise of just playing games in VR, at least at an acceptable level, yeah, $40, not an issue. In fact, a really, really good deal. No, the issue I had, guys, was tweaking the damn frickin' games. Take Skyrim for an example, and we'll use that because we now have Skyrim VR to kind of compare it against, right? That was a game I dearly wanted to play in Vorpx. I tweaked based on settings from Reddit. I was on different forums chatting with people. Honestly, I tweaked that damn game 10 ways to Tuesday. Did I ever even come close to what I would consider acceptable, where I'd want to play the game that way? Hell no, not even close. The next thing I did, because this isn't for lack of trying, we're talking, sometimes weeks and even months in between, but multiple attempts. Then it was, okay, let's go through the suggested list of games that Vorpx does a good job on. The BioShock Infinites, right? Etc. Let's take those games and tweak them, because probably requires a little less. Again, I had absolutely no luck. So for me, that was one of the complaints, that I was spending so much time tweaking, which I don't mind to a certain extent being an IT guy, right? But at the same time, you're tweaking for hours getting a game to work to try to be acceptable. You're already at that point an hour or two in where you kind of just lost your taste for the gaming at that point, right? And sure, it might be a matter of pride that you keep going, but the desire to play, that ship's probably already sailed. So let's fast forward now to the 17.3.0 update. And the good news, guys, we don't need to beat around the bush. It lives up to that initial promise, I think, finally, in the sense that it automatically will use the best settings. So using that same example of Skyrim VR against Skyrim LE, which was the edition that I got to work through Vorpx, it literally was as easy as launching Vorpx, which I have as a auto-started application. So just bringing it up, clicking Skyrim LE, apply close, launching Skyrim LE, and playing. I didn't have to tweak one bloody thing. And you know what? That experience was better than any time I personally went to Reddit, all those forums, to try to get the best settings to experience the game in, even using its compatibility listings, the official ones, fan ones, etc. So absolutely, right off the bat, that $40, which I never really had a problem with, now almost to the point where it's a no-brainer. But I'll continue. How does that Skyrim now, with its best Vorpx settings, compare to Skyrim VR? Is it close? No, it's not close. But it is, here's the caveat, it is at least better. It's good enough that it's marginally better than playing it without VR. In other words, it's worth the trouble if you don't have Skyrim VR, but you like playing Skyrim, of putting your Rift or your Vive on and launching it that way, because it's still better kind of than the vanilla experience by a little bit. The main issue that I had with Skyrim specifically, and this applies to a lot of games that you're going to use Vorpx for, is the user interface. My exact specific complaint was anytime I wanted to swap out weapons, put on new armor, I would have to go into cinematic mode and do it. And I remember discussions with some of you and your comments, rightfully so. I mean, that would be a suggestion for sure, is who cares? It's such a great game. What do you care if you've got to swap out into cinema mode? Well, if you're talking about immersion and presence, which for me are huge for VR, yeah, it's a pain in the arse to have to, every time you want to switch something, step back into cinema mode. So that hasn't changed. That's all still there. But because that initial experience, the actual gameplay part, doesn't require all that tweaking anymore, it's actually something I could live with now. So what about other games where there is no VR game now? And that exactly is what I think the strength is of Vorpx is, yes, BioShock Infinite runs better than playing it vanilla. It's good enough to play in VR. Dishonored, same thing. Those are the two titles that I did some really, really heavy bench testing on. And I enjoyed the experience. It was fun to play it that way. User interface makes sense that there's going to be issues, because those are the things that when you design something for virtual reality specifically, you're going to address. Because of the way the field of view works and the way images are warped via those Fresnel hybrid lenses, etc., you're going to need to have workarounds for certain aspects of the user interface. That's just reality of doing it. But for $40 US, 100 plus games available. And if you're like me, you probably got a ton of games in your Steam library that Vorpx can, to some degree, play. I would say that the Skyrim experience, where I said it wasn't as good as VR, but it was still a little bit better than playing it vanilla, because at least you got some fun in VR. It's already kind of at the top level. But Dishonored, in my opinion, as good as it's probably going to get with Vorpx. I thought that experience was really, really well done and almost felt like it was from the ground VR in terms of developer effort, right? So yeah, if you've been sitting on the fence, Never in the past have I been able to recommend Vorpx. I would say now, absolutely. If you are one of those people, and it kind of ties into what I was just talking about, where you might be bored with VR, you haven't done a lot of gaming, Vorpx may be the ticket for you now with the 17.3.0 update, which of course is already an old update. They're now at 17.3.2, and you got to give it to the developer. Look, there was a little bit of a drama altercation that I got into with the OctoShield developer. And this was back a year and a bit ago. It was in 2016. And it was me criticizing OctoShield. Now, what I said at the time was, and I felt there was some justification to what the developer and his hordes of fans were saying. And therefore, I apologize because I hadn't reviewed the game, but based on what I was seeing via video, it didn't look that impressive. And it was more about making a statement for early access, right? To say, you got to be careful with early access. Do your homework. And the irony is, and I wish him absolutely no ill will, but the irony is he hasn't communicated. It was pretty much, that was the last bit of communication when we had that. A couple of weeks later, absolutely no radio contact with people who purchased the game. It never did kind of go into a full version, right? So it's kind of ironic after all of that original point that I was trying to make kind of made itself, right? But again, you don't wish that on developers. You hope that early access turns into full and has a successful run. So yeah, Vorpx, absolutely. I can definitely recommend that now. If you're on the fence, you play a lot of non-VR stuff, and you're okay with it not being perfect. If you're a perfectionist and you want that kind of level that's approaching Skyrim VR, sadly, you're still not going to find it with Vorpx. Next up, CES 2018, and we're going to get some really good stories out of that. In fact, when I talked about the haptics controller thing earlier, that was kind of one of those that made me say, you know what, let's redo this second episode and include some of what's coming out of CES. So probably, tomorrow's going to be VR Roundup, but the Wednesday episode, I'll try on the podcast to give you guys some CES 2018 updates. What I'm really interested in is, of course, HTC and the VIVE. They're set to make an announcement. Haptics, tech, and gaming, right? Which is what a lot of us are waiting for and hoping 2018 is going to deliver. Look, Ma, no hands. All right, things are going to get a little creepy here, guys. You're seeing, or rather you're hearing me speak, but not seeing my mouth move. It's a static image of me, and that is because there was some late breaking news. Literally while I was editing this to throw the podcast up, HTC Vive go on and make the announcement that we knew was going to be coming, but weren't sure quite when at CES 2018. Well, when was now? About an hour ago, HTC announcing their new screen resolution for their VIVE Pro unit. This new screen resolution, it's going to use 2 OLED panels to achieve 3K. So a combined resolution of 2880 by 1600. Compare that to the current, which is, of course, 2160 by 1200. And that is a significant upgrade. We're talking pixel-wise. I've done the math here. So the new resolution is going to offer 4,608,000 pixels, as compared to currently 2,592,000. That's an increase of about 70% in terms of pixel density. So does this mean that the screen door effect is going away? Not exactly. It means that the threshold, the bar by which it can be seen, is going to move up further along the resolution chart. But people who are really sensitive to screen door effect, sadly, will still see it, but less people overall. Either way, we're going to get crisper images, but here's kind of the irony of what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. When I talked about the need for optimization and streamlining, this pretty much packages it up in a nutshell and lays it out basically at the foot of the Christmas tree. This is exactly what I was talking about. Let's use Fallout 4 VR as an example. Fallout 4 VR, lots of reprojection in that title, all kinds of fixes and workarounds. Now, the devs, to their credit, and justifiably to a certain extent, could say, look, our hands were tied in terms of optimization for Fallout 4 because we were using an existing game engine, which in and of itself was never optimized for delivering visuals to a VR device. And I would agree with that, but the situation is still there. So what we're getting as a result of that is a title that could barely deliver the pixels 2160 by 1200, let alone deliver it to 2880 by 1600. Now suddenly, what you're going to see is an HMD like the VIVE Pro providing even worse performance for a title like Fallout 4 VR. For example, if you had a 1080 Ti and it was giving you barely acceptable performance when you were in the middle of the city or some of those, high polygon count areas, that might tank for you now. And what was barely acceptable will possibly no longer be acceptable. So I still think absolutely there's a need to optimize. But with that said, optimizations do occur consistently and constantly. And we're seeing the Unity engine, we're seeing the Unreal Engine both benefit from a bevy, literally a bevy of update enhancements that include optimizations. And of course, the technology itself is going to improve. So things are going to get better. It's just we need this to kind of more or less happen in parallel. We can't get lazy and rely on the technology alone, or we're going to have situations like we see here where we are literally leapfrogging, but really just displacing the issue when it comes to a title like Fallout 4. So fantastic. The Vive Pro also boasting integrated audio, guys. So that deluxe audio strap no longer required. It's also going to support Valve's upcoming refresh base stations. Those are also going to be shown at CES shortly. We're going to see those. Now, the HMD only upgrade is going to be this quarter with the full package. That's the full package arriving later in 2018. So all in all, fantastic. Now we can talk about exactly that. Controls and what I had filmed and what I'm going to include based on what's coming out of CES. So originally what I talked about, because there was some discussion about this as well, is not having to use something like HOTAS. So one of the comments was, well, why wouldn't you just use 6 Degree of Freedom instead of a HOTAS? It was the MechWarrior 5. That's what it was. Why wouldn't you just use a 6 Degree of Freedom controller? It can do that. And absolutely, there's no argument from me there, right? If you got one of these in each of your hands, you're going to have probably enough functionality between the two. You could more or less duplicate what you're able to do with a HOTAS. But that really wasn't the thrust of what I was saying. For me, and I've talked about this in the past, it's the right controller for the right job. Sure, 2 touch controllers could mimic a steering wheel, but you will get a way better sense of immersion doing not just physically what your avatar in game is doing, which is you're sitting, that helps with immersion. But if your in-game avatar is using a wheel and pedal, and you are also using a wheel and pedal, honestly, the immersion is that much more powerful. So in terms of immersion / presence, while you could, I wouldn't say that would be the right controller, or this wouldn't be the right controller set for a driving game. And I maintain it still wouldn't be the right controller for a mech game. But here's where things get interesting. So there's a company, and I'm just going to refer to my screen notes here, Tactical Haptics from San Francisco. So a San Fran-based company. I'll have some screenshots of this, of their device up. It's designed to work with both the touch controller and the VIVE wands. And what it does is, think of it almost as a transformer controller, like the Transformers, the Autobots, Decepticons, etc., in that it can mimic HOTAS. It can mimic an M16 gun, for example. And it does it in a pretty ingenious way. So this is a company that definitely caught my interest, and one that I'm going to be digging into a little bit more. Do have some concerns, for example, weight. How cumbersome is it? Because you'll notice in those screenshots I've got up, you can see the touch controller kind of dangling there. So all that added weight, when you're standing already, what does that do to the immersion, right? That feeling of immersion, and how tedious is it going to be holding that extra weight? If you're trying to get in shape and you're all of that, hey, that's not the point. It's more, if you're looking for immersion and presence, wouldn't you still rather sit like you are in the mech in game and use a controller that's a little bit easier to use, that you don't kind of have to hold suspended in the air? Because I think there's a time and place for these touch controllers. And that time and place is to substitute mostly your hands in the game or an experience in room scale. You're going to want an actual wheel and pedal combo if you're doing racing, HOTAS, flight, yoke sticks. They've got all of that too for, you know, the really hardcore Microsoft Flight Simulator, for example. So yeah, haven't changed my mind on that, but definitely interested in what these guys are coming up with in terms of a controller that's adjustable, that can be put into different configurations, but not without some concerns. So yeah, if you happen to know a little bit more about that company than what I've been able to kind of scrape together before this episode, let me know in the comments below, guys. Otherwise, we'll touch on them again. Next up, Oculus home sale. I was worried that I'd missed this one, but there's a couple of games on right now. Speaking of racing, Project Cars, for example, that is on for 70% off. So that's a $49.99 US game. Normally, this is for the Rift via Oculus Home, $14.99, so $15. That's a pretty damn good deal. So if you do like cockpit style VR racing games, definitely highly recommend that. Nature Treks is up for 40% off, $6 US, down from 10. And then Shuffle Puck Cantina, I got a kick out of that. Probably one I'm going to pick up myself. It's available for $3, down from $10. And it reminds me a lot of an Amiga game I used to play, which was also out for the PC. I think it was 89, 1990, called Shuffle Puck Cafe, where you basically played Shuffle Puck against aliens, if I remember correctly. Anyways, it was a hell of a lot of fun. Well, guys, that's it kind of for the main topics. What I wanted to kind of end the show with was just a quick kind of, based on some questions, how I configure stuff in terms of studio, game playing, switching between them, talking about Transformers, right? How easy is it to kind of switch back and forth here? So we'll kind of end with that. So you can see here, this is kind of my main green screen. Well, you can't, because that's kind of the point. I realize that as I'm pointing to it. Anyways, it's obvious this is a green screen. I'll have this up whenever I do this type of a show, or I do quick looks where I want to superimpose the gameplay on the background. And it's basically just two kind of mono sticks on tripods with a bar that's modular. There's 5 pieces that I snap together to get different widths. I've got it at its greatest width that you can just lift off. So when I'm switching between a quick look and say VR Roundup, where you see what I've got in the back with the Star Wars memorabilia, VR stuff, etc., I simply lift it off, put it down on the center of the floor, pull the fabric in, takes about 30 seconds, and then move the lighting around. And lighting wise, actually, let's not take that one. I just realized. You guys can see this. There we go. I've got 5 of those. The problem is, and that's been the issue. Sorry if the background fades a little bit. The problem with those is they're not really good for the top of your head. As you can see in the first episode, the massive beacon of light is because of these. Apparently the ring lighting is better for kind of, the brightness bouncing off the dome. But yeah, 5 different individual lights that I have help bring kind of the lighting level up, which is important with the camera I got. It's a 4K Sony FDR AX33, which is notorious for one negative, and that's poor light levels. So still, it was under $1,000 at the time for a 4K camera. Other than that, it's a hell of a lot better than the webcam that I was using. And I've still got this jerry-rigged, which is basically the Blue Yeti mic, because, as I pointed out in the first episode, you go through the batteries on that lav mic if you forget to turn it off. Like borscht, it's just way, way too quick. And that's basically it. And several tripods if I'm doing different things. Oh yeah, lastly, finally I've got the Vives, as you can see in VR Roundup. You can see it, you won't now, but they're ceiling mounted. And then I've got on my desk in front of me, you can see here, that's the tripod for one of the Rift sensors. This is my angled one to the rear, and then I've got 2 permanent ones on either side of my desk. So if I'm doing seated like Elite Dangerous, those are all that I use. If I want to do room scale, I basically just plug that into the active USB 3 extension that I have, and I'm good to go. So could it be better? Hell yeah, and I'm going to work towards that, but I'm going to wait till the spring. We'll make things a little better because I do want to have the Rift sensors permanently mounted at some point. Well, guys, that is it for the second episode. Again, really appreciate the feedback. Likewise, some of the topics that we covered, really like to know particularly about your VR gaming habits, what your kind of percentages, VR versus non, etc. And with that said, guys, hope you're having a good week. We will be back for VR Roundup tomorrow. And then if all goes well, podcast Wednesday and Thursday before the Gaming Friday edition. Guys, as always, cheers.